0.95 lenses for Fuji. I've been on the fence for a while about getting the Midicon version of that lens since it came out, because I have the wonderful Fuji 35 f1.4, so never really got around to ordering one, as I didn't really see the need versus cost. However, when 7 Artisans announced that they were doing a version for about half the cost, I jumped right into the internet and ordered one up for myself to try out. Now, for those who don't know 7 Artisans, they're a Chinese company making kind of inexpensive lens options for various cameras, including Fujifilm. But can a lens that costs so little really be any good? Well, it arrived a few days after the last wedding that I shot in 2020, and that was a pity as the shoot started at 5 AM, and that 0.95 f-stop was sounding pretty good to me that day, but still, it finally arrived and I've been using it for almost 2 months now, so I thought I'd better get back to making some YouTube videos. Now, the lens is made out of metal and has a couple of ultra-low dispersion elements that apparently help reduce color fringing and chromatic aberrations. More on that later. The rings are both nicely dampened with only a light one finger pressure needed to turn either ring. The aperture ring is declicked, so smooth if somewhat vague in its operation. Good for video, perhaps not so much for photos, until you learn the lens and get used to it anyway. The aperture ring is also placed in front of the focus ring, and you have to remember that in use, at least in the beginning. There are nice looking and clear markings on the lens, including the distance scale, and that helps with range focusing. The mount fits really snug on the body of the camera, and there's no wobble at all, so all in all, this feels safe, like a premium lens. And the included lens cap is reminiscent of the older caps you'd get on a Leica 75mm M f1.25. Unlike most other caps, it's not attached by clipping it on, but instead by sliding it on, and that's held on with a bit of felt that creates enough friction to prevent it falling off. I kind of like that fit and feel. It's also metal, and unlike some other reviewers have mentioned, mine stays firmly on, even if I try my best to shake it off. Now, there's no weather sealing at all on the lens. It does fit quite snug to the camera mount, but there are no gaskets to be found. So you need to be careful if you're intending to shoot if there is moisture or lots of dust about. Again, we've other lenses for that. But overall, it's a good example of build quality here. Now f0.95, this is the reason you buy this lens. Well, probably mostly the reason. Compared to the more usual f1.4 or so apertures of a lot of primes, 0.95 should let in a little over 1 stop more light for an equal lens t-stop anyway. Again, we're going to get into that in a minute. And gives you a more shallow depth of field, like a 51.4 gives for the same framing on a full frame camera. Now, 1 stop is a doubling of light, so moving from 1.4 to 0.95 means you'll be able to shoot in about half the light for the same exposure, or it can shoot in twice as fast a shutter speed or 1 stop less ISO. That's quite nice. However, in use, I found the difference between shooting at 1.4 and 0.95 in terms of brightness was only about 1/3 to maybe half a stop, and not the full stop you might have expected. The transmission value or t-stop of the lens is probably showing its true nature here, even when placed against the Fuji XF 35mm at the same aperture. The Fuji is a little brighter, meaning that there is less light transmitted for a given f-stop, or at least for the markings on the lenses. That's all we have to go on here, as there's no clicks. But considering the price, it's not something to worry about too much. So here we are in Capture One. I just have a color checker set up perpendicular to the camera. The camera is locked off on a tripod. I'm taking a test shot with the Fujifilm XF 35 f1.4 wide open. My ISO is 160 and it's showing 1/200 of a second to get good exposure. Now all I did was just swap the lenses. I didn't move anything around, and you will see here if I swap over to the 7 Artisans 35mm set at f1.4, the image seems to move. So I think there's a bit of bowing in the lens, or else the focus is a little bit tighter than 35mm, at least compared to what the Fuji say 35mm is on their cameras. Now if we hit P on our keyboard here to get the loop up in Capture One, and I scroll in here on the Fuji, you can see it's really sharp here on the edges and down in the corners. Obviously, as you might expect, it's very sharp, and obviously in the center it's similarly sharp. I was focusing around this area with all the cameras here. If I compare that with going over to the 7 Artisans at 1.4, it is quite a similar in sharpness. In fact, let's get the two of them up on screen so we can see. This being the 7 Artisans here, and it's rendered there. So it's not quite as sharp as you can see here. Definitely some fluffiness going on here, but I think in the center you're still getting pretty good sharpness compared with the Fuji, which I think is a little bit sharper. No doubt, there it is. Just a little bit sharper than that. In fact, if we go in at 200%, you can really see the difference if I put them side by side. I think that's pretty evident to say. Now, if I was to swap over the 7 Artisans to its 0.95 aperture and do the same thing. So we want to select those two there, and this being the Fuji here, and obviously this is 0.95 on the 7 Artisan, so not much competition. It isn't sharp, at least compared to Fuji. However, if you move towards the center of the two lenses, I think the Fuji is a tiny bit sharper, but the 7 Artisans really does show its good colors in the center sharpness here. So if that's what you're looking for, then it's not a bad option to have. I mean, it's not as sharp as the Fuji lens, but it's pretty sharp. And I think if you zoom back out, you're really not going to notice too much of a difference there at all. So one of the things to notice here is at 1/200th of a second with the Fuji lens, we're getting good exposure at 1.4. At the guesstimation of 1.4, according to the markings on the 7 Artisans lens, with the same exposure, it is looking like it is perhaps a little brighter. So it's kind of hard to say if that's really where it is or not with that lens. But if I move to 0.95, it only moves up to 1/250th of a second, so that's not much of a jump, and certainly not the stop you might be thinking you'll get. Well, 1/16 stop actually between the two, but if you've got about a stop, you should be happy. But that's only really 1/3 of a stop, so something to consider with this lens. If you're going to be thinking you're going to get a lot of brightness out of it, you're probably not. It does get a little sharper as you close the aperture down though. And as is mostly usual with lenses, in the mid-range of f4 to f8 will give you the best sharpness. Although even when you stop down to fully closed at f16, there is reasonable sharpness to be had, at least in the center, considering the overall offering this lens gives. But you don't buy a lens like this to shoot at those f-stops. You buy it so you can shoot at 0.95. And thankfully it's good there, or at least in the center, as the sharpness falls off as you move towards the outer areas of your frame. But unless you are placing your subject on the edge, then you'll do just fine. I've found that I get a sharper image when I'm focusing in the range of kind of near to mid focus, as when I move the focus towards infinity, the sharpness of the lens falls off a little bit, even at 5.6 where the lens is at its sharpest. Something to remember if you really need a sharp shot. But in all reality, unless you are a big time pixel peeper, it's not going to bother you one bit. Focusing is easy here with this smooth feeling knurled focus ring at the end of the lens. Dampening is light enough so you can easily focus with one finger if you want, right down to a close 37 centimeters. Yet there's enough resistance to easily feel the movement of the focus ring. I do tend to keep moving the aperture ring though when I focus, as all of my lenses have the aperture control behind the focus ring. And this one is in front. And I've had to let my fingers learn this lens for a little bit longer than usual. The focus throw is only 90 degrees, so you can easily use one finger or thumb to focus from near to infinity, and this will help a lot with moving the aperture when focusing. For the first couple of days shooting with this lens, I was focusing and then rechecking the aperture to make sure it was still wide open, and would often forget, ending up with a shot that was somewhere between f1 and f8. Not ideal at all when you're testing out a lens for review, but thankfully I got past that fairly quickly. Breathing is something that video people will care a lot more about than stills photographers, and on this lens it is not well controlled at all. Focus breathing is when the framing of a lens changes as you rack focus from near to far. It's like this, the lens zooms in and out. On modern lenses this is usually somewhat controlled, and lenses like Fuji's MK cinema zooms, it's non-existent. Anyway, if your frame is moving in video, you'll probably not notice, but if you are to push focus between near and far subject on a static shot, then you will definitely notice the movement. And this will be something to consider if you plan on shooting video with this lens. The aperture ring is well marked though, with clear space numbers, until you get to the f8 to 16 range, and then it's a very small movement to go from f8 to f16. With f5.6, it's marked as a dot between the 4 and the 8, and about the sharpest setting for this lens. But typically if you're anywhere between kind of a little bit less than wide open and f8, you're going to get sharp shots in the middle. Okay, so the biggie here, and one of the main reasons why you buy a lens like this, is the narrow depth of field that you get shooting wide open with its 0.95 aperture. The depth of field is quite small if your subject is close, but you can still have good separation when your subject is further away. This can make getting your focus just right a little difficult, but when you get it spot on, the look is delicious. Lovely sharpness with really smooth out of focus areas. The bokeh is also quite nice here, giving mostly round bokeh balls with very little onion rings and good shape until you get to the outer half. You have to remember that this is only a 35mm lens, so although a stop faster than the more usual 35 1.4, your out of focus area will more than likely not turn to mush. You'll need a longer lens for that. But as 35 goes on the APS-C Fuji camera, it's giving you the most mush for your money. Yes, the lens has no hood included in the box, and flare is present at times, but not always. So if you don't want to have flare, then you can get a cheap lens hood on Amazon, like this one I bought for about tenner. It screws onto the filter threads, which are also metal, by the way. And there's also square versions available at a higher price if you prefer that look. Okay, so here's the very first shot that I took with a 7 Artisans 35mm 0.95 on my Fuji. This was on my X Pro 2, and of course it's a picture of my cat, because that's what you always do when you get a new lens, isn't it? Take a photograph of your cat. There's the before, and that's just a quick edit I did just for me. Not sure I really got the focus on that one. I think I missed the eyes a little bit, but I possibly front focused it a little bit, but it's the first shot. I don't really mind, just to see if it works, and it does. A few shots later, Dave is making me a cup of coffee as I went for a walk to see what's about. I really like the steam of his machine here. I think it looks really good. Obviously this is edited, so that's it out of the camera. And you can see there, and that's it edited in. That's the close focus distance. It's just a cup of coffee sitting on the table here as I was waiting for the rain to stop. A little bit of bokeh in the background here, but not much. So as I'm sure you can see in the next shot, we'll go on and look at the bokeh, but I think you'll see this is pretty sharp at 100% in. Plenty of detail there at close distances. And there's the bokeh now, and yep, just some traffic lights up ahead. Pretty clean. Bit of scruffiness is probably due to the rain that's on the lens, because as I said, it was raining that day. Here it is again, just walking home. I focused down here on the car and to get the Christmas lights which were up on my little village where I live in the countryside. And that's it edited. That is it not edited out of camera, as it were. That's scrolling on, a little bit more bokeh. In fact, I put this photograph and that photograph together to make a little ad for them. I put the bokeh in the background of that image here, which looked quite good in the end. A bit more bokeh there, and there's my mate Rob, who was just sitting in very conveniently waiting for me to take a photograph as I got him to look up. My friends are patient with me, which is nice. That's it out of camera, and if we zoom in here to 100%, actually that's going to 200% here, you can see there is a little bit of detail in there from the raw file, but if we edit it we can bring a lot of that out, of course. And yeah, I think it looks pretty good. I mean, there's plenty of sharpness in there. You can see the fall off of sharpness down the jacket here as it comes away. Actually, probably a bit easier to see if I turn off the edit as it comes away here. So yeah, plenty of detail, plenty of sharpness around the center anyway. Again, there's Ruben 100%. You can see the detail. James there, if we go into him, 100%, 300% even, plenty of detail where the focus is, but you can see, if you look at the nose, already it's starting to blur away here. So you have a very narrow depth of field at 0.95 on 35mm on an APS-C camera. Not as much as you would have on a bigger sensor, but still something you'd have to watch out for when you're using the lens. It's really easy to miss the focus on it. Here's a picture of a swan that was swimming over to me. These are two of the swans that live on the lake in our estate. Quite friendly, because I've been down looking at them pretty much every day all year. I photographed lots of their cygnets when they hatched last year, which was a real treat. So they've got very used to me, very trusting of me, but at the same time, they're wild birds. It's their home. I'm just visiting, so you got to respect that when you're out. Give them their room. But they always come over to say hi, probably to see if I'm going to feed them. Not that I ever have. A rather boring shot of the rather wonderful big house called Castletown House on the grounds where I live. And this will just give you an example of focusing when you're not in a close focus. If I go into 200% here, you can see just how soft that image is at 200% here. There's really not great. So I think all these were shot at 0.94 for very close to it. Something you'd have to consider, I think, if you're looking at something far away. I think it's more to do with the resolving power of the lens rather than it being sharp or not sharp at this level. As you can see, if I come into 200 or 300% here, there really just isn't the detail there to make it happen. Whereas if we go into James, when he's closer, there's plenty of detail here, but we're looking at much larger things as we compare with this. So something to consider, I don't think the resolving power is huge on the lens, or maybe mine just doesn't focus towards infinity very well, but it is what it is. The camera was telling me it was in focus, so that's the best I could get out of it at that distance. Nice shot of some sunlight coming in on the car, just again on the main street after the sun broke. And here's a picture of some flares coming in. I know I'm running through these real quickly, but just you don't really be seeing my boring snaps. So just to give you an idea of what's going on. Some lens flare coming down into the sun, it's not too bad here. Some sharpness, if I come in at 100% here, I think there's decent enough sharpness here. This is on the edge at the median distance. This one here, as you might see there, it's cropped in a bit towards the center, and possibly I focused a bit better, but that's 200% and absolutely crazy sharp. It's really nothing to complain about at all in this lens in terms of sharpness, at least in the inner 50% of the lens. Some bokeh, my Christmas tree lights were on, and you can see here, although it's okay, it's got a hard ring around the edge of these ones in particular, and more lemoning towards the edges, as you might expect, which probably, you know, for the price of the lens, I don't think you can really complain about. And the shape of bokeh doesn't really bother me too much. It's quite smooth when it's wide open, and a little bit of lemoning I don't think really matters. Not to me anyway. Here's a little picture of a robin I shot. Very hard to get this. I did think I missed his eye a little bit, possibly focused a little bit too much in the foreground, not quite hitting him right, but it is hard to do that at close distances. This was on my X Pro 2, so I was kind of guessing the focus because I had the camera on the floor and it was wet and snowy, so I didn't want to lie down and look at the LCD screen. I should probably do these again with my X Pro 3, XT3 rather, so I can flip the screen out, but there we go. Nice atmospheric shot into the sun, and here's a shot of James. I was focusing to try and show some chromatic aberration. Now you can see on this, it is particularly bad. There is massive purple fringing here, and if I go into the lens tool tab, even with chromatic aberration and on nothing happens, but purple fringing turned up to full, it gets rid of a fairly good amount of it, but still there. So I think the real way of getting rid of this would be to create a layer, grab a brush, and just brush on. I'm going to do a little bit of this, but just brush out kind of the purple here, and maybe the purple there. And then we'll get our color picker and we'll select some of this purple. Did I grab the color picker? I did. Select some of this purple here, and then we just drop it. So there we go. So there we are. As you can see, it's turned off. Not ideal, but it does work. Here's a shot just close up. Again, that's cropped in a little bit from the edge, but good level of sharpness and detail, fine detail available there. So minimum focus distance on that one, not very interesting. So this one here just gives you an idea of that kind of 3D pop you can get. Let me just go before and after. So this is out of the camera, and if I zoom in here, we can see plenty of detail as you expect. So I think you're seeing a pattern here. There's plenty of detail. The lens is good and sharp. Some pictures of some swans, and yep, again, nice and sharp, nothing to complain about here. Lens is very usable, and of course we stay safe because it's 2 meters, and I hope everyone's doing well. Let's talk about value. Yes, all things considered, this lens is amazing value. A well-built 0.95 apertured 35mm lens priced at close to half the cost of the other budget 0.95 available here, the Midicon 35mm. Now I bought mine at full price from 7artisans.co.uk for £249 with free worldwide shipping. And a good experience it was too, with great constant communication from their sales director. I did order this before it was available. For the price, the 7artisans 35mm f 0.95 lens is an easy purchase if you were looking for a nice manual lens that happens to open up to 0.95. And as a bonus, 7artisans UK are offering all of you 5% discount off this and any other lens they offer with the code below. And a link to their site is also in the description. Well, that's all for me. See you.